Ben Rhodes, thanks for joining me on UpFront. The influential foreign policy commentator David Ignatius of the Washington Post recently described the Iran nuclear deal as, quote, the most determined strategic success of the Obama presidency. Is that your view as well, that this is your high point in office so far on the foreign policy front? I mean, you were personally involved behind the scenes in some of the negotiations, weren't you?
You know, I think what was unique about the Iran deal is it took 6.5 years to get it. This is something that involved the president coming into office, offering diplomacy. When diplomacy did not work because the Iranians could not respond, we had to build a sanctions regime and implement that over a period of years. And then it took 2 years of negotiations to arrive at the final deal. So really, this is something that the president stuck with because of the importance of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon for years. And certainly, I think, given the focus he puts on non-proliferation and stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, it's among the most important foreign policy achievements that he's had as president. But again, it's not the only one. We look at a range of issues.
You're not giving it the award of top achievement?
I wouldn't want to give it the top achievement because there's a major trade pact that we're seeking to conclude in Asia. There, of course, was the bin Laden operation.
President Obama used to always say again and again that the military option is on the table. That was a phrase that was used again and again by the president, by yourself and others. Now he says the alternative to this deal is war. That's the stark way he's framed it to his Republican critics. So I just want to clarify, as of today, is the military option in relation to Iran on the table?
It will always be an option that is available, an option that is on the table, for the simple reason that we have a policy of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And that means we will do what is necessary to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
And yet you yourself have conceded in other interviews, as have military experts, intelligence experts, that a military option doesn't stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, it just slows it down.
That's exactly right. And that's why
So what's the point of it?
Well, the point, diplomacy is preferable. It's a better way of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Our preference is absolutely to not engage in a military conflict with Iran over its nuclear program. So if the deal is implemented, this is not going to be a question.
There are some, like Ambassador Frederick Hoff, a former advisor to the administration on Syria, who say that your eagerness to do a nuclear deal with Iran made you turn a blind eye to what the Iranians have been up to in Syria, basically propping up one of the world's most brutal, violent regimes, the Assad regime. He says you granted impunity to Tehran over Syria in order to get this deal.
That's absolutely not the case. The fact of the matter is we've had sharply different policies from Iran in Syria, predating even the negotiations that led up to the nuclear agreement. What we said is we're going to compartmentalize the nuclear issue. That is of such consequence and would pose such a grave threat that we want to deal with that diplomatically.
You say Assad needs to leave power. That's been the US position since 2011 when Obama said he has to go. And yet last week in London we saw John Kerry, Secretary of State, saying, quote, we're not being doctrinaire about the specific date or time he goes. He said Assad doesn't have to leave on day one or month one or whatever. So what is the White House position now? Is it Assad has to go now, as it was for the last 4 years, or is it Assad can go after there's a deal some way down the track?
Well, we have to see what the outlines of a political resolution would be. The outcome of that political resolution, we believe, has to include Assad leaving power for the simple fact that the Syrian people would not accept his legitimacy.
The outcome, it's not a precondition anymore. Before it was a precondition.
Well, it's a precondition that any settlement has to involve him leaving.
But he doesn't have to leave before you get to a settlement, because that was the US position.
Well,
the
again,
regime has to change, was the US position.
Our position continues to be the regime has to change, that he has to leave power. How, again, you structure that agreement, who the parties are involved. Look, there are a lot of questions.
But he could stay on as a transitional president while negotiations and a peace deal is being done, is what you're saying, is what John Kerry is saying.
Well, we're not endorsing that outcome. The best outcome is for Assad to leave. We think that offers the best hope to start a new day.
Sorry to pass the language. Yeah. You're not endorsing it, but you're not opposing it either, as you have done in the past.
Well, again, we want to see what are the ideas. When Russia comes to the table, what are they presenting as a political resolution in Syria? Because what we do not believe is that there's a military resolution.
Well, in the past they have said a transitional period.
Yes.
He doesn't have to go before the parties arrive in Geneva or wherever you sit down.
That's right.
Is that now the US government's position? Because it wasn't in the past.
We're not going to take a public negotiating position on this because, frankly, there is not the structure of an agreement on the table right now for us to consider. What we need to do is sit down, and I'm sure these conversations will take place at the United Nations and beyond, with all the relevant parties and discuss Assad's leaving, but also how does the opposition come into a transitional government? Who are the key players in the opposition?
So from a US government perspective, there's no precondition to peace talks in Syria?
No, we want to have peace talks.
Without preconditions?
Yes, we are open to any type of dialogue about concluding the conflict. Again, the condition for a government that we could accept is a government that is not led by Bashar al-Assad.
The CIA has been helping Syrian rebels fight against Assad for a while now as part of a covert program. Last year, the White House announced a $500 million Pentagon program to train rebels to fight ISIL in Syria. By the end of this year, there were supposed to be 5,400 Pentagon-trained Syrian rebels fighting in Syria. Do you know how many Pentagon-trained rebels were fighting in Syria as of last week, according to the general in charge of CENTCOM?
He testified that there were only several of them fighting.
4 or 5, I think, was the numbers he gave.
Yeah.
That's pretty embarrassing.
Look, this has not gone as we would like it to have gone. That is clearly
understatement. 5,400,
yeah.
5.
But look, this is a complicated situation. There are many, we have to learn from our different policies in Syria. When we look at this Pentagon program has not succeeded in training the numbers that we'd like. We would be the first to acknowledge that that is a completely unacceptable outcome, but we are going to learn from that and try to get better as we go forward.
Hillary Clinton said in her memoir last year that the US's failure to build up a credible rebel force in Syria under President Obama, quote, left a big vacuum which the jihadists have now filled. She's basically blaming you, your administration, for ISIL, for the rise of ISIL.
I think that that's wrong, because I think that, look, the notion that it is an easy, as your question about the Pentagon program just demonstrates, the notion that there is a simple or easy way to just build an army of an opposition quickly so that they can take over the country, I think has always been overstated. It is difficult work to try to provide support and train a competent security force. In Iraq, we have a standing army, the Iraqi security forces that we trained for years, that have had trouble against ISIL. The notion that we were going to be able to make contact with people that we were just beginning to get to know and be able to build them into an army in some period of months.
Here's what I don't understand. I mean, there was a Defense Intelligence Agency document that was released under Freedom of Information earlier this year, which showed that in 2012, you guys were being told, you were getting intelligence reports as a Deputy National Security Advisor saying that Al-Qaeda is dominating a lot of these groups, and yet you carried on training, arming, working with them.
Well, but this points to the issue, which is that we very carefully vet who we train and support, and we have to be careful.
They just gave all their weapons this week to Jabhat al-Nusra. The American-trained rebels went into Syria this week and handed over their weapons to Al-Qaeda.
And look, what you have in Syria is you have lots of different groups fighting. Some of them are extremist groups like ISIL. Some of them have ties to Al-Qaeda. Some of them are people who are just fighting in the same space as those people and may not share that agenda. And so this is a very complicated piece of business.
And the ISIL threat specifically, there are a whole bunch of intelligence analysts who are now quote-unquote in revolt. I believe more than 50 of them, US intelligence analysts working out of Central Command, have formally complained that their reports on ISIL have been altered to fit the administration's narrative that you're winning the war against ISIL when you don't seem to be. And I want to ask you about those analysts, because of course President Obama was a big critic of Bush and Cheney's misuse of intelligence in Iraq. Now some of the same guys who objected to Bush and Cheney's use of their intelligence are saying you guys have misused their intelligence. Well, that's pretty damning.
First of all, this has nothing to do with the White House or the President. This is a question about what is happening within Central Command and within its own intelligence
reports
apparatus.
To you?
Yes, and there's an Inspector General's report that will look into these reports. The President wants to get the best information. He's not looking to cherry pick intelligence to make any case.
But if more than 50 analysts are saying that their intelligence, not 1 or 2, 50, are saying that their reports were altered, that must worry you. That must concern you.
That does concern us. And again, they're not suggesting that we are doing that out of the White House for some political purpose. They're suggesting that's happening within CENTCOM. So that's going to be looked at. It worries us because we need good information to make good decisions.
Barack Obama is seen by many Americans here in the United States, by his critics on the right in particular, as being soft on terrorism, as being a weak president, a reluctant warrior. And yet abroad, the paradox of Obama is there's a very different perception of him. In the Middle East in particular, the Muslim majority world, they see him as a president who has militarily intervened in 7 different Muslim majority countries. Do you think the Iran deal, the Nobel Prize, the opening up to Cuba recently will outweigh the hundreds of drone strikes that have been so controversial, killed so many people in Yemen, Pakistan and elsewhere, including the killing of US citizens without trial by drone?
Well, the first thing I'd say about the use of drones is that is a far more targeted way of taking out terrorist leaders and terrorist networks than invading and occupying a country like Iraq. So there is far less civilian casualties, far less suffering than large-scale military operations like we saw in Iraq. And we have been able to decimate the core of al-Qaeda's organization. But when I think the people look back at the president, what they'll see is somebody who believes that strength is not defined purely through the use of military force. And in fact, a president who understands that just throwing the military option at problems can make things worse, can exacerbate humanitarian crises, can create the types of vacuums that can be filled by terrorist groups.
And yet experts, military generals, intelligence officers, an internal CIA study say exactly the same thing about drones. They say that drones can exacerbate, radicalize insurgents, create vacuums.
And we take that very seriously, and that's why we sought to impose...
You take it very seriously. You've carried out 9 times as many drone strikes as George W. Bush.
We've imposed, we did not invade and occupy.
Okay, but if the Iraq War is your benchmark, well done. But if your benchmark is international law, not creating more terrorists than you kill, you've not done a very good job with drones, some would say.
Well, I would say that we've decimated the al-Qaeda network.
At what cost?
Look, obviously, this is a controversial issue around the world. But if the United States knows that there are individuals who are plotting to conduct attacks against our homeland, against our allies, we have to take action against those individuals. The
former head of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, Robert Grenier, says drones are creating more enemies than we are removing from the battlefield. He doesn't think it's making America more secure.
Well, our judgment is, and the president's been very clear about this, this is not someone who goes out of his way to use military force. I think people understand that about the president. But when our direct security is threatened, we are going to use military force. We are going to do so in the most targeted way possible so as to avoid
Was the 16-year-old son of Anwar al-Awlaki posing a direct threat to the United States when he was killed by a drone without any trial or due process, a US citizen in 2011?
No. And again, we've been very clear that there are civilian casualties. This is a weapon of war. And in war, there are civilian casualties. And those are tragic. Every loss of life is tragic, particularly innocent loss of life. But again, if there are terrorist networks,
but he wasn't a terrorist. He was a 16-year-old American teenager.
And again, we've acknowledged there are civilian casualties. The notion that the United States is going to do nothing or is not going to use military force when we have information that there are direct threats against us.
But you're only killing terrorists, is your claim?
I didn't say only. I'm acknowledging there are civilian casualties. But I'm saying...
But they're accidental.
Well, in war, there are civilian casualties.
The Sunday Times...
we acknowledge civilian casualties. We go beyond other countries. I don't see...
Not when it comes to drone strikes. At one stage, the American government was claiming there were no civilian casualties from drone strikes. You remember that well, John Brennan.
The President of the United States ordered a review to make sure that we had clear rules that governed how we used these weapons and that we could be more transparent about the fact...
But you're still using signature strikes, aren't you? The strikes whereby you kill someone without knowing who they are, based on a pattern of behavior.
Again, without getting into our intelligence methods, we take strikes when we feel it's necessary to protect our forces in Afghanistan or to disrupt a terrorist plot. And again, I think when people look at the United States, we are a country...
You target people with drones when you don't know who they are. It's a simple question.
I just answered it. We take action when we believe there is a threat.
So you do kill people when you don't know who they are?
We take action only when there is a threat to U.S. forces or to U.S. personnel.
And if you believe there's a threat, you will use a drone to kill someone without knowing who they are?
The president has discussed this at length publicly.
So why not answer the question if he's discussed it?
The answer is yes, that there are individuals who are targeted because of their role in al-Qaeda and their plotting against the United States. But we've said that when there's a continued and imminent threat to the United States, we'll take action. The president was very clear in a speech at National Defense University, for instance, that if there's a threat to our forces, we're going to take action. And again, you're focused on the drone as the weapon. The question is, does the United States permit that type of threat to exist against our personnel, our facilities, our military overseas? We're not going to accept that.
Do you think other countries
take
should be allowed to use drones to eliminate threats abroad to their national security?
I think there should be, and the president has said this, as with other weapons, there should be a discussion around what are the rules and norms that govern the use of this type of technology. And that's a conversation that we are more than willing to have with other countries.
So other countries can use drones to take out threats if they see a threat to their national security?
You're focused on drones. Drones is just a weapon.
right? Yes. And I'm
so
asking,
it
can
could be
other countries use that weapon to take out threats to their national security?
But the way we look at it is it's a use of force, right?
Yes.
And you could use force with a drone, you could use force with fixed aircraft, you could use force with missiles. So the question, again, is whether or not it is just and what for a country to be using force beyond
outside of a war zone is the other point.
But you're focused on, again, the method.
Yeah.
I think the way we look at the legal basis for this is whether or not we have a justification in taking action in self-defense. That's the critical question for the international community.
Just before we finish, you were 32 years old when you were appointed Deputy National Security Advisor and Special Assistant to the President. But before that, you were a speechwriter on the campaign. You were a guy with a degree in creative writing. You wanted to write novels, I believe. And suddenly you're in the White House helping to run the war on terror on behalf of the world's most powerful man. What's that like? Bit of a culture shock?
Well, again, first of all, I had a background where I had interest in writing. I had worked for several years here in Washington on the 9/11 Commission and then on the Iraq Study Group. So I had transitioned fully into a foreign policy career. I went to work for Barack Obama not because I wanted a job in the White House. I never had a plan. I didn't say I want to be the Deputy National Security Advisor, I want to be the President's speechwriter. I went to work for Barack Obama because I wanted to help him get elected president. And I wrote speeches for him and I helped advise him on foreign policy. I think what has been most consequential to me personally about being able to serve in this job at this time is I truly believe in what President Obama is trying to do.
Ben Rhodes, thanks for joining me on UpFront.